Hello, everyone. Happy Halloween. I'm Ed Morin, an Amador County Master Gardener and your moderator for today. Thanks for attending the Amador County Master Gardeners Public Education Program entitled Putting Your Vineyard and Garden to Bed. Before we begin, I'd like to go through a few housekeeping items. Please be aware that today's program will be recorded and posted on our website and our Facebook page. Please leave yourselves on mute during the presentation. We will be taking questions at the end. Just type your question into the chat to everyone. We'll collect them and cover as many as possible today. For your convenience, the handouts and presentations covered today will be posted on our website in the next couple of days. Look under classes and events, then handouts and presentations. If you wish to review the recorded presentation, go to our Facebook page and look for Facebook Live during the meeting or find the video link on our feed later. Next slide, please. If you have gardening questions at any time, please contact us. The UC Master Gardeners of Amador County are working by phone and email to answer your questions. You can contact us by phone 209-223-6838, by email mgamador@ucanr.edu, on Facebook at UCCE Amador MG. If you're not located in Amador County, we strongly recommend that you direct your questions to your local Master Gardener program. You can find them by doing a web search for UCCE Master Gardener and your county name. Okay, housekeeping is done for now. I'm going to turn over to our presenters for today, Don Martella and Maureen Engel. The video and slides will be managed by Doris Mosblick. Don, it's your turn.
Well, welcome everyone. I hope you have a great day today, and I hope you're enjoying what we're presenting for you. So I want to talk today about putting the vineyard to bed. So Doris, if you want to go ahead and start the video, we're going to watch a little video, and then from there we'll transition to the garden portion, and then we'll do questions. So enjoy.
My name is Don Martella, and I'm with Amador Master Gardeners. And today I would like to talk to you about putting your vineyard to bed. Because a little bit of effort expended in the fall has a huge difference on your next year's growing season. So the vineyard we're in today is planted with a wine grape variety called Dolcetto. This vineyard was planted with leftover vines from a commercial vineyard planting, and it's essentially been treated as bird food and landscaping. So beyond pruning and irrigation and in some infrequent fertilization, it's had minimal care. Pretty much something that you really don't want to do. So learn from my mistakes. First thing I'd like to start out with is when you're looking at your vineyard in the summertime, you really want to make a mental note of how your vines are doing. Looking for things that could be indicative of nutritional issues is important. Paying attention to vigor, watching for mildew, mites, bunch rot, irrigation problems. All those things can have an impact on your vine, not only this year, but for next year's growing season. So in this vineyard, I noticed that there is some nutritional issues starting to develop. You can see some venation patterns in the grapevines and the leaves. Over here especially, I have a big notice of one. I have venation patterns. I have these short little leaves that are starting to show up. They're getting a little funky look. On the vines themselves, I've noticed some unusual fruit development, and because this is used as bird food, the birds have been very good this year. So this is the rachis of a normal cluster, but I've also had these unusual fruit set clusters. And so even though there's no berries on them, you can see with the pedicels that there's a lot of space between the actual berries, whereas on a normal grape cluster, you're going to have, you know, a much more tighter closed cluster. So that's telling me that something's going on with this. I've pretty much determined it to be a zinc deficiency, maybe some other nutritional items as well. So noting these can give you a game plan for next year. And if you're not sure, say you're looking at your vines, you're seeing what you think are nutritional issues, but you're not sure, go ahead and have your soil tested. There's a lot of different testing companies available, and that way you're going to get a definite analysis knowing exactly what you need to apply. So what do you do first? Well, immediately after harvest, you want to go ahead and give your grapes a really good drink. You know, they've been working hard all summer long getting your fruit ripe. So giving them a nice deep drink allows the vines to revive somewhat so that they can begin that work on storing carbohydrates. The other thing is, in the fall, pay attention to the weather. Oftentimes we'll get some rain. We'll think that might work for irrigation when actually if you dig down into the soil, you'll find that it has a very shallow penetration. So in this vineyard, I typically will water about every 2 to 3 weeks until the rainy season begins. So you do want to check your irrigation once you start watering to make sure that your vines are getting adequately watered. And let's go ahead and walk over here because I want to show you a great simple way to do so. So coming over here, you want to dig a hole. So you water your vines the amount of time that you think they're needed. The day after, go ahead and about 18 inches or so from the vine, not under an emitter. It can be near one, but not under emitter because that would be cheating. You want to dig about a foot deep hole. And you're looking in the hole, and the purpose of looking in the hole is to make sure that there's moisture all the way down, because that's showing that the water is actually getting down into the root zone. If the hole is only partway dry, you obviously need to increase your time that you're watering. Vineyard on the average I found needs about 12 hours or so, give or take, depending upon temperatures, in order to get that good penetration to the root zone. So one thing I always try to have people remember with watering, especially as you get into the fall, is the duration or the amount of time that you water in order to get that water to the root zone. Once you've established that, that's not going to change. What will change will be the frequency or how often. Like I said, if the temperatures are warmer, maybe every couple weeks. As the temperatures get cooler, but it's still dry, maybe every 3 to 4 weeks. So just keep that in mind. So from the period of September through November, this is a time to watch out for pests in your vineyard. Things like mites, things like powdery mildew can become an issue at this time. So we're going to go ahead and throw a slide up here and let's talk about mites. If you have hot, dusty conditions, if it's dry or the vines are poorly irrigated, these are really good conditions for mites to develop. Now, with the slide here that you're seeing, you're going to see the damage that mites can cause. And their feeding causes a stippling effect on the leaves. It looks almost like they're slightly bleached. The other thing that you'll notice with mites is if you turn the leaf over, or sometimes you'll see it on the bud nodes, you might notice a little bit of webbing that's occurring. And if you actually have a hand lens, you can look on the underside of the leaves and you can actually see the little tiny mites crawling around. A second type of mite, and we'll go ahead and put this slide up now, is called the Grape Uranium mite. And the Grape Uranium mites cause blister-like galls on the surface of the leaves. And the Grape Uranium mite can become a very big problem if it's not addressed, because these will definitely overwinter in your bud scales and the population will flourish the next year. So how do you treat them? It's pretty easy. Neem oil or a horticultural oil is great for treating mites. If you use it, you do want to make sure that the underside of the leaves are thoroughly saturated. You also want to make sure that your wood and your trunks and all that get saturated, because mites can overwinter not only in woody tissue but also in the bud nodes. For the uranium mites, there's actually been some new research done by UC that shows that a wettable sulfur application applied after harvest has shown really good impact at reducing the numbers for the following season. So something to be aware of. The other problem that you really want to pay attention to is what's called powdery mildew. And in the vineyards, we usually see this starting to show up if conditions are right before harvest. So sometimes you'll see it on your grapes. You'll definitely see it on your leaves. And you can see by the slide that it just gives this powdery, dusty appearance. This is a problem if you have a lot of shade, if the temperatures are somewhat cool and damp. And it's important to address powdery mildew because you want to limit any overwintering spores. Now, the treatment for powdery mildew is similar to mites. You can do neem or horticultural oils, although we found that wettable sulfur works really well on getting rid of powdery mildew. Okay, if you are spraying your vines in the vineyard this size, I will probably be using a backpack sprayer. But if you are spraying your vines at home and you just have a few and you want to use just a little hand pump sprayer, it's really important to remember that they have to be saturated. You really need to get a thorough coating on the underside of the leaves as well as the woody tissue. A few considerations I really want to mention when it comes to spraying for both mites and for powdery mildew. So first of all, when you spray your grapes, you never want to spray if temperatures are going to be 90 degrees or above, because you can get some severe leaf scorch on your vines. The second thing is products like your neem and horticultural oils, so that's one type of product, and your wettable sulfur, which is another type of product. Those products should never be mixed, nor should they be sprayed close to one another. Because if you do so, you can get severe vine burns and you could even kill your vines if they're young and weak. So if I was to spray using both products, first thing I would do is I would water my vines the day before, because that makes them a little bit more resistant and gives them a little bit boost to get through the spray process. Spray with my neem oil, maybe I'm dealing with mites or what have you. Then I'm going to wait about 2, even 3 weeks if the temperatures are warm. And if I have a powdery mildew situation develop, then I will spray with my wettable sulfur. Personally, for me, I think it's easier if you use just one product. It's definitely a lot safer. Either one is useful on the vines. And the last thing I want to emphasize, and this is something that's really good to get in the habit of, is if you are spraying, you want to make sure that you use proper personal protective equipment, your PPE. So what is PPE? Anytime I spray, I make sure that I have covered shoes, I wear long pants, I have long sleeves on, I have gloves on, I have a face mask on, and I wear eye protection. While some products might be pretty gentle and benign, other products, especially in the case of wettable sulfur, can be very irritating to your skin and definitely irritating to either your eyes or your mucous membranes. So I've just found as a personal rule that if you make it a habit to wear that every time, you're never having to worry about being safe. It's a good idea to do a light fertilization at this time as well. Your main fertilization is going to occur in the spring once you experience that new growth surge. But in the fall, the vines need a little bit extra nutrients to hold them during the dormant season. You will use a slow release fertilizer. You can use a synthetic. You can use an organic. You can use a combination of manure and compost. But you want to do one that's a little bit lower in nitrogen, really emphasizes mostly on the potassium and the potash. And the reason for that is if you have too much nitrogen, you're going to actually stimulate new leaf growth, and that's something that you're trying to avoid. You do need a little bit of nitrogen because you need to stimulate the roots to start uptaking those nutrients. So there's 2 methods to do so. One is a band dressing, and the other one is a broadcast method. So with the band placement, you want to do it about 2 feet away from the vine. And the reason for that is that's where your feeder roots are located. You go about 2 feet from the vine. You're going to dig a light trench about 2 inches deep. With your fertilizer, you'll follow the application rates that are listed. Good rule of thumb is about 1 pound per 100 feet. And essentially what you're going to do is you're just going to put the fertilizer at that prescribed rate within the trench. Once you've added the fertilizer, you definitely want to cover your fertilizer because that way you avoid any type of nitrogen loss, which is really important. For the broadcast method, you'll go again about 2 feet away or so from the vine, and you want to lightly cultivate an area. If you have a few vines, you can do it in a rectangle around the vines. This is an actual aisle, so I'm probably going to do a whole cultivation in the aisle. You will broadcast it. You can do one of the little broadcasters according, that spreads it. You can do it by hand, what have you. So lightly cultivate your soil to a depth of about 2 inches. You can go ahead then and take your fertilizer, and at about that prescribed rate, go ahead and spread that out. You will want to mix that in, okay? That's really important. The other thing that you can do is you can do a combination of manure and compost, and you want to use an aged manure. And so with your manure, you'll actually spread about 1 inch thick, okay? And if you have one of those little push spreaders, those things are amazing for this. Makes it a lot easier. Then with your manure added or your broadcast fertilizer, you definitely want to mix it into the soil. Again, you want to prevent that nitrogen loss. So you mix it in. I'm doing this quickly for the sake of the video. You might want to take a little bit longer and just get a good mix in there. Okay? Once that's mixed in with the manure, then again, take that spreader and cover that area with your compost. Rake it smooth or what have you. Now, if you were planning on doing a cover crop, this is a great time before you do the final cover to actually plant your seed, because you can put your fertilizer down, add your cover crop seed, mix it in, and then go ahead and cover it with compost. If you were not going to do a cover crop, you can also do a mulch. The compost does act as mulch, but a further mulch on top of that is actually a good idea. We use here in this vineyard, I have a little bit of a rough wood mulch around the vines. That's something that you get from the PG&E trimming crews. That works great, especially if it's slightly aged. You can do leaves, you can do straw. What's important is you lay it out, put a cup at least 2 to 4 inches thick. You want to keep it away from the vines though. So you want to allow at least 6 to 12 inches from the vine when you're laying your mulch out. And the reason for that is it could trap moisture if it was against the vine and cause crown rot issues. And that's something that you want to avoid. But mulch is great in the vineyard. They've done a lot of studies lately. They're finding it's wonderful for moisture retention. It's great at weed suppression. And it really helps it helps prevent a lot of runoff in the vineyard. All right, so if you are considering cover crops, a few words on that. You may want to consider, especially with around grapevines, a seed mixture instead of just a single cover crop such as a fava, clover, or legume. The reason for that is seed mixtures usually provide a much more diverse benefit to your vineyard. They will usually consist of things like grasses, maybe some grains, the legumes, the fava, the clover, and all that. If you've ever driven through our Shenandoah Valley down near Plymouth in the spring, you'll see some of the vineyards will have the cover crops, and they just look so pretty. Another advantage to cover crop is they're wonderful for giving you a really good green manure in the spring. If you've had pest issues in your vineyard, like mites or powdery mildew, once you have leaf drop, it's really important to remove that litter. You don't want to go ahead and leave it here, because then all you're doing is overwintering any inoculum or problems. So if you had the pest issues, rake up your leaf litter. If you have any rotting fruit or mummies left on the vine, dispose of those too. Definitely don't put them in your compost pile. You don't want to trade problems. If your vines are healthy though, leaving the leaves drop is really great to adding organic matter to your soil. So as cold weather approaches, and hopefully the rainy season approaches too, the last thing that you're going to want to do in the vineyard is shut down your irrigation system. One thing that's important to remember though is if it is a dry season, if it is a dry winter, you may periodically need to turn the system on, irrigate your grapes, shut it off, and drain it again. So there might be a little bit more work in that instance. But as a rule, on a normal season, you'll shut off your main valve, which is your feeder. Once that's shut off, so the water here to the vineyard would be shut off completely, I would then take and drain out all of my irrigation lines. Open them up, turn the valve open, allow them to drain out and empty. Once that's done, I do reclose these because it keeps debris and bugs and everything out of the lines. I disconnect my risers, insulate them a little bit more, and then a good way to protect them even further is to just throw a bucket over the top, and that just gives you that one extra layer. You're done once then, and you're good to go. So let's recap, shall we? So remember to note any vine issues in order to create a game plan for next year. You want to water deeply and immediately after harvest, and you want to do it about every 2 to 3, maybe 4 weeks until the onset of the rainy season. That's really important. Address any pest issues such as mites, powdery mildew. You will lightly fertilize, and you can mulch or plant a cover crop at that same time if so desired. If you've had infected debris from pest issues, you want to clean that up, including any rotting fruit. And then as the cold weather approaches, shut down and drain your irrigation system. As you can see, a little extra effort on your behalf this time of year can give your grapes a head start going into dormancy. And that's something that's going to have a great benefit on next year's growing season. So on behalf of UC Master Gardeners of Amador County, I want to thank you for joining us today. Happy gardening.
Okay, so Dawn, you had some final comments?
Yeah, so just a few things. These are little things that I didn't mention, and I meant to. So when you're choosing your NPK fertilizer, you want to get one that's like a 5-10-10 or a 3-8-5 for your fall application. That'll give you that little bit of nitrogen that you need for root stimulation, but you're really feeding that potash, potassium. The other thing, and this is really important, and that is you always want to water your fertilizer in after you apply it. That way you start that leaching process down to the roots. You're not having to wait for the rainy season to get going. And then I mention this because sometimes if people are growing, especially wine grapes or things of that nature, you may note pest issues right before harvest, especially in the case of like powdery mildew. A lot of times you can usually wait until after harvesting to address them. Powdery mildew, though, keep an eye out for it because it usually shows as light splotches on the leaves, and that can get bad fast. So if you feel like you need to spray before harvest, you want to check the label on your spray to see how many days you'll need to wait after applying before you can actually harvest your fruit. Because I'm in the wine industry, I don't recommend using wettable sulfur for powdery mildew issues right before harvest. It does have an impact on flavor, especially if you're doing home winemaking or anything like that. So just a few of those little things should help, and you'll be great to go. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Okay, so now we're going on to Maureen. Maureen is going to tell us about the rest of the garden.
Okay, thanks, Doris. Thank you, Dawn. That was very informative. In fact, I want to thank the attendees for coming to our class today. And this section will be more generalized suggestions for your garden, but you will see some of the best practices that Dawn mentioned brought back again in this presentation. Just to note, we're doing long distance clicking today. Doris is going to run the PowerPoint for me, and I'm going to narrate it. From Doris is up in Pioneer, and I'm down in Ione. So please bear with us if we have some slight lags. And we also have some bandwidth issues in this area. So I'm going to continue to narrate, but I'm going to turn my video off while I'm talking. Do that now. Okay. All right, when it's time to carve your pumpkins, it's probably time to be thinking about putting your garden to bed. When I was researching some of the information for this presentation, I came upon this quote by a farmer named John Kemp. I don't know the fellow, he lives back in Ohio, but his comment was the main idea we're trying to convey today. The end of October or beginning of November is really the first day of spring, because everything you do in the fall sets up your success or lack thereof for the next year. Next. Okay, I organized this around 3 big ideas for cleaning up your home garden. Cleanup, compost, and cover. Okay, next. First off, we want to clean up, and Dawn mentioned that also. Generally speaking, you want to harvest everything that's above ground in your vegetable garden and fruit trees. Clean up any fallen fruit or vegetables. They do draw pests. Now, there is some difference of, no, we're not there yet, Doris. This is a little longer. There is some difference of opinion on when you should pick the last of your veggies. If you live here in Amador, where you get freezes or it snows, a lot of the gardeners prefer to leave their tomatoes, peppers, maybe their eggplant up until that first freeze. The freeze will basically kill off the plant, and then they take it up then. And as a recommendation, it's better to cut your plants down and try to leave some of the root material in the bed. There's a lot of activity going on under the soil, even though the main part of the plant is on its way out. You can take out the really dead parts a little bit later on, but if you can, rather than pulling the whole plant out of the ground, it's better if you can chop them off at the soil. But make sure to chop them off, because you can get regrowth if the weather's nice. Now, Dawn mentioned pests, and that's an issue in your home garden also. There are a lot of insects that like to lay their eggs in plants, and then they overwinter, then their larvae come out in the warm weather. You want to try to avoid that. You don't want to provide that environment. Also, there's diseases that will lay dormant in your plants over the winter in the cool weather, and then spring back up when it gets warm. And so if you clean up very well, if something is yellow or dead, it's not coming back. Take it out. Next. Okay, now there's also some discussion over how to clean up your landscape plants, and it really matters where you live. Throughout California, our landscape plants do not all, first of all, we don't grow the same things, but they don't grow the same way. The same plant might act differently depending on where your location is. But generally, clean up your landscape plants. Again, anything that's dead is not coming back. Remove your annuals. You can always replant those next year. Now, with perennials, take care with pruning. Some perennials can be pruned now, and others need to wait. Perennials such as peonies, hostas, daylilies, they can be pruned in the fall. But wait until the springtime for things like lavender, lilacs, azaleas, and even some salvias. Sometimes pruning will cause unwanted early new growth, and Dawn mentioned that. You don't want new plant material coming out in the cold weather or when it's snowing. And then also, some of these plants have already formed their next year's buds. And I know I've done that. If you remove too much of the plant, you're removing what's going to flower next year. So you have to be rather careful with that. If it freezes where you live, go ahead and dig up, dry, and store some of your summer flowering bulbs to be replanted in the spring. And that might be something like dahlias or gladiolas. When you're cleaning up, if anything looks diseased, put that in the trash. Don't compost it or try to put it in your garden for any reason at all. And want to suggest retain some of your perennial foliage for birds and beneficial insects that will be visiting your garden during the winter. Next. Oh, I just wanted to make a comment about the lavender. Some of these perennials just really look shaggy right now, and you're very tempted to trim them. Please look that up. Research the plants you have growing in your garden before you start cutting into them. I know I made that big mistake with French lavender. I trimmed it all back to get it to look nice and neat. And I trimmed so much of the plant off that it was dead by spring. And so that I want to warn you against something like that. Next, please. If you have a lawn, you can keep it growing. It'll grow until the weather changes. Keep mowing it as long as the grass appears to be growing. California lawns vary quite a bit. The kind of grass that people use doesn't all behave the same depending on where you live. Some grass stays green all winter. Other grass will end up with a lot of brown spots, but that's perfectly normal. If you have trees or shrubs near your lawn that have dropped their leaves, if they're small leaves or you've shredded them, you can just leave them in place. Doesn't hurt anything. But if you've raked up leaves into large piles, you'll smother the grass if you leave them. I'm sure you know that. You move your pile and you've got a lot of dead grass. So don't leave piles of leaves on top of the grass. A good technique is to mow the grass and the leaves together and then just leave it on the surface of the lawn as compost. Now, got to put a plug in for oak trees. First of all, you shouldn't really have an oak tree planted in the middle of your lawn, but sometimes it bothers people, all the leaves that fall from some of the oak trees. Some of the oak trees are deciduous and they'll lose their leaves in the winter, and it's a lot of leaves. But that's the future food for your oak trees. So please be careful. Don't remove all the leaves from underneath your oak trees. You can neaten it up a little bit, but leave leaves underneath the crown of the tree. Next. Okay, now I know you don't want to hear this, but pull all of your weeds now. I already have them growing in my yard again, and it hasn't even rained yet. It's a better idea to stop them now while the conditions for regrowth will be difficult. The weather will cool off, but the rain will come and the rain will cause them to germinate. It's best with weeds at this point, and it's pretty easy because there's not too much growth. It's best to remove the total plant and the root. This is not a case where you just want to chop them off at the surface. Try to get everything. It really will cut down on time you spend on weeding in the spring. I know it seems a ways off, but it'll pay off for you. There's much funner things to do in the spring than to go back and cut your weeds down. And overgrown weeds will often give pests an early start in the spring. A couple of years ago, we had an invasion of leaf hoppers in the very late winter, early spring, as soon as it started to warm up. Our office was just inundated with calls, what to do with the leaf hoppers. And when we researched it, we found that if you cut all the weeds down very early away from your growing areas, it'll cut down on the number of leaf hoppers. So highly recommend. Don't put your garden to bed before you pull the weeds. Next, please. Now, if you have an herb garden, you want to clean them up. It's okay to trim them. Again, if the leaves have turned yellow or they look dead, nothing's coming back. So it's helpful to your plant to tidy them up a little bit. A lot of herbs that we grow in this area are pretty hardy over the winter. You might want to cover them with freeze cloth if it snows, but things like sage, thyme, oregano, rosemary, they can usually do okay left outside, sometimes with a little protection. If you want to, you can also use a cold frame or a homemade small greenhouse to protect some of your herbs. Now, mint and basil, you can dig those up and bring them indoors in pots. But one caution is anytime you bring your plants indoors, you want to spray them with an insecticidal soap and maybe quarantine them from your other plants for a couple weeks. And that gets to the house plants. Many people take their house plants out in the summer and put them on the patio or the deck for decoration. Well, it's time to bring them back in. Depending on where you live, there are plenty of parts in plenty of places in California, especially near the coast, where you don't really have to bring the plants back in. It's just not going to get that cold. But in this area here in Amador, it snows. So bring them, spray them again with an insecticidal soap, and then kind of quarantine them from the other indoor plants you may have for a couple weeks. Make sure you're not bringing any pests inside. And sometimes because they've been outside with a lot of light, some plants will benefit if you add a couple additional lights nearby. And actually, you don't really have to buy fancy grow lights. A regular incandescent bulb does provide additional light. Next, please. Okay, now with trees and shrubs, you want to take a look-see, inspect your trees. You want to remove any broken or dead parts. So any broken limbs or dead wood, you do want to remove that now, but don't do any big pruning. Wait until the tree is dormant. This is another case where if you start cutting things, you can often induce some unwanted early growth that the tree's not really ready for. Now, taking off broken limbs, you really need to do that, use proper procedures. I've included some really good resources with this that you can download later on that show you exactly how to trim a limb off your tree. If you do it inappropriately, you can easily damage the tree. So it's very important that you follow the good directions for that. Now, if you live where it snows, you might want to protect some of your smaller trees and shrubs. And an easy way to do that is to surround them with some material, some snow fencing material, and then pack straw or shredded leaves into the cylinder to protect the trees. You can also use different kinds of freeze cloth over it. Now, if you're the type that likes to buy a Christmas tree and then you plant it in your yard, a hint is dig the hole before the ground freezes. Cover it with a board and store the soil because you'll want to use that to put back into the hole when you plant your tree. Next. Okay, we're going to move to the second idea, and that's compost. Compost is really for your soil. It's for your plants, but you're feeding your soil now, and it'll continue later. So we recommend you add compost to your garden soil in the fall to prepare it for spring planting. It's sort of like time-release fertilizer in a way, because compost is really food for your soil organisms. You want to add several inches on top of the soil. You don't need to really till it or mix it in. Dawn showed some ways where she covers up the material. There's nothing wrong with that, but you don't have to bury it deeply. Now, compost is actually decomposing plant and animal material. It's rotting, or it could be worm castings, which is basically worm poop. Next, please. Now you can make your own compost. I've included the upper left-hand pictures are compost devices that you could have at your home. I have one that's similar to the one made of pallets. That isn't mine, but I have one like that. And actually for homemade compost piles, my favorite, and apparently the favorite of the Sacramento Master Gardeners, I borrowed their picture. This is what's called a geo bin. That's actually a commercial name, but we kind of use it casually also. This is the perfect way to make compost for a home gardener. It's just a cylinder and you can move it, but you pile up your materials, and in that, it's very easy to deal with. What I don't recommend are some of the compost makers that are like a barrel that you turn and the barrel rotates, because you do have to turn your materials. But those type of compost bins I found, of course I got one to begin when I was a new gardener. They're very difficult to turn once they get full. So most of us have given those away to unsuspecting gardeners. Oh, a quick note, Sacramento Master Gardeners and Sonoma Master Gardeners have just dynamite material on composting. They're real experts. I included them in my resources, and I highly recommend, if you're into home composting, go to their websites. They have lots of good pictures and lots of good information. Now, some of us use worm castings for our compost or in addition to our other compost. And it's easy to set up a little worm bin in your yard. You can get worms here locally. To contact your master gardeners, they may know someone, and you can also Google for that. Here in Northern California, there's several worm farms, and you can go out and buy some worms. They are specific worms that they're leaf litter worms that we use in the worm bin. They're not the earthworms that you find kind of deep in the ground when you dig in your garden. So you want to make sure you use the right kind of worms, and it's fun to run a worm bin. Now, if you can't have a compost pile at your house, you can buy it. You can buy it from the store. I included a couple pictures of some common brands that you can find at the big box stores or the nurseries around here. And some places you can buy it in bulk, where you can buy a truckload. Sometimes you can have it delivered. You can pick it up yourself. That varies widely. There's a couple places here in our county in Amador that it's very inexpensive. You can take a bucket or your truck over and fill it up. So check your own area for access to bulk compost. Now, animal manure is used also as compost, and Dawn mentioned that also in her presentation. However, if you are not used to having animals, you need to be cautious with using animal manure. First of all, the kind you want to use is from animals that eat plants or bugs, not meat. It changes the nature of the material. And excuse me, animal compost comes out, what they say, hot. I'm sure everybody's seen how if your dog pees on the grass, eventually the grass dies. Well, you have to be careful with animal manure. When it's new, it's too strong to put directly on your garden. So it has to season, as they say. It has to be piled up somewhere and set for weeks, months. It depends on the type of animal. I've included a great resource in the resources for how to deal with animal manure if you're not familiar with it, because it's usually very natural. It's a very good way to increase the nitrogen in your garden, but you have to be careful with that. I just got one chicken, my neighbor abandoned it. And my daughter reminded me, don't let the chicken mess around in your vegetable garden. Make sure to clean that out because her waste material will burn my plants. Okay, next, please. Okay, now my third big idea is to cover the soil. And there's a couple ways to do that. You heard about mulch from Dawn. I'm going to talk about mulch myself. The mulch material is different from the compost. Let me talk about that real quick. Compost is material that's already rotting, and you want it to. It's providing food for microorganisms. It contains bacteria, good stuff. Now, mulch sets on top of the surface and works as a blanket. It should be organic material. Now, rubber is technically organic. However, you don't want to use something that just sits on top of the ground. You want material that's natural, that the interface of the surface of the soil and the mulch, the blanket material, will break down over time because it protects the soil, but it also adds nutrients. There's a lot of different kinds of mulch you can use. You can just use leaves from your yard or grass clippings. You can use straw, wood chips. If you buy it at the store in bags, you're probably going to end up with wood chips. If you live, Dawn mentioned the PG&E tree cutters. In Amador, they're cutting down a lot of the trees for fire protection up country, up in the forest. And you can contact PG&E to find out where they're working and often make arrangements to get them to dump their shavings on your property or in your driveway. I don't live in the forest. I live in the lower elevations of Amador, and I don't have access to pine trees. I have oak trees on my property, but they don't really provide wood chips. So I end up buying it at the store. You can also get mulch delivered depending on where you live in bulk, like the compost. So look in your, Google it, look in your phone book, talk to your neighbors, see where they get their mulch. Next. A mulch is kind of a multi-purpose protection material. It protects the plant crowns and roots from extreme temperatures, whether hot or cold. But just as Dawn mentioned, you don't want your mulch up against the base of the plant. Pull it away 6 inches at least, because it can cause rot there. So you're not up against the plant itself, but close by. It helps reduce water loss due to evaporation in the warmer weather. It does work as a protectant to the soil. And I know reduces erosion. My property, all of my growing area is at a slight slant, like many other people in the foothills. And especially during the winter, if it rains hard, I have a lot of problem with erosion. So I have a lot of areas mulched to prevent that. And it's working pretty well. That I talked about weeds before. Mulch really helps suppress the weeds because they don't get any sunlight. And then when the weeds, if they do make it through the mulch, they've had to travel a distance and they're actually really easy to see and to pull out. So we highly recommend mulch. Next, please. Sometimes there's a little confusion about the difference between the compost and mulch and where it goes. Now, they both break down over time and produce nutrients for the organisms that live in the soil. This is kind of a roundabout way to feed your plants, because the compost and the mulch, they provide material for the organisms that live in the ground that are helping the plants grow. But sometimes people are confused as to which is which. The organic compost will be a finer material, much smaller particles. And it's already begun to decompose or to rot away. And that's what you want. So that goes on the soil surface first. Then if you want to add mulch to it, and again, Dawn mentioned this too, because best practice, the mulch goes on top of the compost. It sits on top. So you do have several inches of protection on your soil. And at the same time, yeah, all those materials are breaking down and providing nutrients as well as protection to your soil. Next, please. Okay, we have a different way to cover your soil, and this came up in Dawn's presentation about the vineyards, but you can use a cover crop in your home garden also. A lot of us do. The cover crops are grown they cover the soil to protect it, but because of the type of plants you use as a cover crop, they also help enrich the soil. It's a great way to maintain and improve your soil health throughout the winter. And Dawn mentioned this too. One of the reasons I love planting cover crops is they look really good in your garden during the winter when you might not have a lot of other things growing. They take very little effort and your garden stays green throughout the winter months. Now, certain plants are better as a cover crop, because a cover crop, you kind of want a plant that will have a strong effect on your soil. So legumes, they could be different kinds of beans. Fava beans are popular around here. Peas, clovers, vetch. I know some of the counties pull up the vetch, but vetch is a very good plant to use as a cover crop. You just have to kind of watch it depending on where you have it planted so that it doesn't spread out. There's a number of grasses that are used in the cover crops. Oats, barley, and rye are some of the most popular ones. One of our master gardeners is actually growing oats as a cover crop this year, but she's doing it to control some organisms, some bad organisms in her soil. So she's doing it, she's using oats as kind of a remedial cover crop. You basically are you grow them and then you cut them down before they flower, because if you wait until they flower, they're giving more energy to the flowers rather than the roots. You chop up the plants, and then you just lay them on the soil or mix them in lightly. Now, sometimes I get a little carried away with my cover crops and there's just too much plant material to leave on top of the soil. So the extra goes in my compost pile. So all of it gets used. Okay, now, next, please. Okay, now cover crops actually have several purposes. So you want to choose the crop that solves the problem you have, like the oats that my colleague is growing. So cover crops can do different things for your garden. They can increase the soil organic matter because you're going to turn a little bit of it back into the soil. They're going to increase nitrogen balance in the soil. And I'm going to cover that one in the next slide, but we don't want to go there yet. They suppress pests. I find very few weeds that grow with my cover crops. They kind of take over, so the weeds don't get a chance. And I've noticed that there just aren't very many insects that bother the cover crops. The birds are really the biggest pest there, and I'll address that in a minute. They do provide habitat for beneficial insects. A lot of us are trying to have plants in our garden growing all year that help the pollinators. And a lot of us leave some of our cover crops to actually flower. And I've noticed a lot of insects are drawn to them in the wintertime because there isn't a whole lot else happening in some gardens. So it's a good way to provide a little bit of extra habitat. Cover crops can enhance your soil biological activity. A lot of cover crop plants tend to have pretty deep roots. They open up the soil a little bit. Plants need air underneath the ground to help them grow. And the long roots help the plants develop the ability to draw water from a lower place underneath the soil. So there's a lot of good things that are happening under the ground with biology that you can't see, but that the cover crops are enriching your soil. Again, we mentioned they control erosion. If you have an area that's at a slight slope, this is a great way and a pretty way. They look really good when they're growing. And they prevent compaction. The extensive root structure that a lot of cover crops have, they kind of keep the soil a little bit open. There's more pore spaces, and that's healthier for your plants. Let's see, next, please. Now, very often people talk about planting cover crops and using plants that we say encourage nitrogen fixation. Now that sounds real fancy, but it's pretty simple. All plants have bacteria under the soil near the roots that help them take up nutrients, or they couldn't live. But certain plants have nodules on their roots, and those nodules help the microbes or the little microscopic organisms. They're bacteria that always live in the soil. They're good bacteria. Plants can't grow without them. But plants with nodules are able to concentrate the nitrogen. The bacteria concentrates the nitrogen in the nodules. The nodules slough off into the soil and add extra nitrogen to the soil. And when you remove the plant, the nitrogen is still there for your summer crop that you're going to put in later. What the bacteria do is they pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere. Now, our Earth's atmosphere is 78% nitrogen, but plants cannot use the nitrogen directly from the air. And so the microorganisms have the ability to pull the nitrogen out of the air, into the soil, into these nodules, and then it's released so the plant can access it later. Great way. Nature has figured out a lot of cool ways to make things happen. Next, please. Now, you might wonder kind of what some of these cover crops look like. Dawn mentioned using a mix. I do the same thing. The bag on the far left is a mixture. It's listed as a soil builder because that's what I'm interested in, is just providing more nutrients in the soil. And that's a mixture of some beans. I think there's some fava beans in that one, some peas, and some grasses. The middle bag is something I've come to like, the Austrian peas. They're real pretty when they grow, and they seem to work really well for my location. The bag on the right is some buckwheat that I'm actually saving for the warmer weather, because I have some spots on my property that have a lot of weeds and I would like something else to grow there. So I'm going to try to plant some of that in the warmer weather. Usually people use cover crops during the winter, but there are some cover crops you can plant in the warmer times of the year also. Now the little bag in the front is called an inoculant. It's kind of store-bought bacteria. In order for the cover crop seeds to really do well with attracting bacteria, you have to kind of give them a little start. And so it's best to use for your home garden an inoculant, which is really just a powder that you mix with water according to the directions. And then you throw the seeds in and mix them all around and get them all coated. And then you plant them like that. And the inoculant is actually some bacteria to kind of jumpstart things. Now, I have to admit, the first year I planted cover crops, I didn't know about the inoculant. But my crops still grew, but they probably weren't as effective underground as I'd hoped for them to be. Cover crop seeds are really, really inexpensive. And you can, depending on where you live, you could Google or look up who sells cover crop seeds and what might be appropriate for your area, because it depends on what you want them to do for you as to which seeds you actually choose. Next. Okay, this is what it might look like in a home garden. This is, I'm going to show you a couple of my raised beds. I use cover crops in the ground as well in my raised beds. Before we started up, we were all talking about our gopher problems, and that between the rocks and the gophers in Amador County, a lot of us plant in raised beds. Now, the picture on the upper left, this is, I plant the seeds and then I immediately cover them, because I think the birds like sit on the fence and watch while you're planting. And then when you go in the house, they come and they dig them all up. Because if you don't protect them, it seems like cover crop time is when all the white sparrows hit my backyard. And I'm happy about that, but they'll take out all the seeds if you're not careful. So I never plant until I'm sure I can cover them up that day. What I use is some wire, flexible wire fencing that I use for my tomato cages. And I just change the form a little bit. And the white material, it's sort of like a cheap Agribon. It's a different material I got, I think at Ace Hardware. It's a very, very, very thin freeze cloth, but it lets through the light and it protects whatever's underneath that. So I'm protecting it from the birds. Again, insect pests have not been a big deal. Now the upper right, sometimes I'll use tule netting, just fabric that you would buy at a fabric store like Joann's or someplace like that. That works really well too. Now both types, I save and wash them each year. So I get a number of years out of, I just throw them in the washing machine and then hang them up outside and they're good to go for next time. One note on the tule netting, it's better, it's hard right now, but it's better if you can pick that out in person. You want a thicker tule netting. I bought some, not to down talk Walmart, but I ordered some online and it was very, very, very thin and it didn't work well, but the thicker type works great. Sometimes I leave the covering on, sometimes I take it off. The picture on the bottom shows an example of when once the plants I think are big enough to fend for themselves from the birds, sometimes I'll take the cover off. Oh, also the rain goes right through it, so you don't have to remove it or anything to water. Some of the crops though are attractive to the birds, so the last couple of years I've been leaving the cover crop on until they're quite tall so that the birds don't go in and eat all my good stuff. Next, please. This is just another example of what it might look like in a raised bed. The picture on the left, I planted and covered right away. And the picture on the right is one that I opened and decided just to let it fend for itself. They don't look real pretty right now because there's no flowers, but it does look like you have a lot of activity. You've got a lot of stuff growing in your yard during the winter, and that it looks very nice. Next. Okay, garden equipment. I'm going to leave my 3 big ideas for a couple more hints. And again, you're going to hear some of the same things Dawn said, because this applies if you have a large growing system going on like a vineyard, or you have a small backyard garden. Okay, you want to take good care of your equipment so you can use it next year. Drain your garden hoses thoroughly, especially if you live where it freezes. Remove all fittings and store your nozzles. Roll your hoses up and store them in a dry area if you can. Wash your gloves, clean your boots, store those inside also as possible. Wash the soil off all your shovels and your different digging implements and dry those and store them. I don't have the ability to put all of my tools inside. So one of the things I do is I get them out of the rain, but I cover them up with the buckets that Dawn showed you, and that seems to work pretty well. Now for cutting implements, I should have put clean and sharpen your cutting tools and then oil them and store them for next year. Now, I didn't put this on the slide, probably because I'm struggling with it right now, because I keep having to water my plants. I was hoping the rain would be coming, but you do want to turn off your irrigation. If you have a timer situation, one of my neighbors, his sprinklers keep coming on, and I went over and asked him if he had it on a timer or what he was doing. I didn't tell him what to do about it, but every time I see his sprinklers come on, I think about it. You want to turn your timers off. Now, the warm weather has made it so that we do have to continue, depending on where you live, continue watering some of your plants, but your main irrigation system is probably ready to be turned off for the cold weather. Next, please. Now, this is a good time to clean and disinfect your pots that you use for your plants in the containers. You can use a 1 to 10 bleach water solution and then put those things away. You should empty any outdoor containers, especially if you use clay pots, to keep them from cracking. You don't want them to gather water. Store them upside down if you can't put them indoors someplace. And I know they look nice in your yard, but clean and store stakes, cages, garden ornaments. They'll last longer for you. Now, I didn't put it in the slide, but this is also a good time to do repairs if you have them. I got gophers in one of my raised beds, and that's because I didn't put the hardware cloth in properly on the bottom. And I'm in the process right now of fixing that, so it'll be good to go in the springtime. And another thing you might try, some people, especially if you're new to your gardening area, or if your property was subjected to a fire or anything, you might want to do a soil analysis now to help you prepare ideas for the springtime. Next, please. Okay, this is a good thing to do to refresh your memory of all the things you thought of while you were growing your plants this summer and to prepare for the future. Walk around your garden area, evaluate your successes for the year, what went well, what didn't. Think about changes that you want to make for the next growing season, but think about them now so you can remember them. Make some maps or sketches of the locations that you use to grow various crops. Tomatoes and squash, a number of vegetables should be rotated every few years. You don't want to grow them in the same place each year, but sometimes it's hard to remember exactly what you had growing where when it comes to springtime and you're ready to start over. It's a good idea to record your ideas in a journal. You can take pictures or make a video with your phone. You can make a recording, talk into it, and that way you'll have it to look back on for next year. Now, that kind of puts your summer garden to bed, but next, please. If you're not quite ready to give up, fall is a great season for planting here in California. So I just wanted to make a couple comments about that. This is the time to plant your landscape trees and shrubs. If you plant them now, they get rain, they get water irrigation from the rain. And the couple months over the winter, they'll spend time developing a strong root system. If you wait and plant them in the warmer weather, they're busy growing and the roots just don't end up as strong. I know I'm a new gardener to this area and I've made that mistake. And I've seen how clearly planting in the fall is much better for many of these larger plants. It's also the time to plant California wildflower seeds. Again, we encourage people to plant pollinator plants in their garden, and this is the time to start. You lay out the seeds now. They don't do a lot for a while, but once the weather warms up, you'll start seeing little plants coming up in your garden, and before you know it, you'll have poppies in the spring. This is the time to plant bulbs before the ground gets hard for spring flowering plants. So it's a good time to get some things in the ground so that you can enjoy some daffodils and some of the other pretty plants in the spring. And you can actually plant some cool weather vegetables. Next, please. A good way to plant some winter vegetables, if you have a small garden, is to use containers. These are some pictures from various, some of the gardens from Master Gardeners from our group. Some people plant in larger containers, some people plant in small. One of my favorites is on the upper right. One of our gardeners, Marie, introduced us to cut and come again lettuce. Is you grow the lettuce in a container and you pick off the leaves on the sides for your salad, but you don't actually pull the whole head up yet, and the plant will replace those seeds. It's a really fun way to provide yourself with salad during the winter. Now I have a couple pictures of one of my winter gardens at the bottom. This is right next to my deck. It's important to put your winter garden where it's convenient for you to get at so that you can keep an eye on it and to enjoy the harvest. I usually just grow some lettuces and cilantro. I'm on this search for growing cilantro around here. And I have it at a convenient spot, but again, I have to cover it up from the birds. The birds love the lettuce, so they'll pick it all apart. And it doesn't have to be a big formal covering. Birds don't like things flapping around. So if you just gently cover your growing area, if birds are a problem, that'll be fine. Something came up while we were prepping this class is because of the weather this year, just lately, I realized yesterday that a lot of my lettuce and my cilantro have decided to flower. They're bolting. So I'll save them for the bees, but I won't get too many salads out of that, I'm afraid. Now, but I encourage you, plant a few things. There may still be time. It just really depends where you live as to what you can grow. If you live closer to the coast, you can manage a lot of this throughout the winter. Again, check with your local master gardeners of what they would recommend you plant in your area for a winter garden. And I think that about winds it up. Doris, if you'd go to the resources slide, I have just a comment on that. Okay. This is some of the resources I used for this presentation, but what I ended up doing was creating a separate document that I can see some people had trouble downloading. Tracy's going to straighten that out. I created a separate document that is a checkoff list for most of the things I just said in this presentation, but it's a shortened version for you. And then about double the amount of resources. I have resources for the compost, for the mulch, for plants that you should grow, for pruning, using animal manure as a compost. So there's a lot of good resources on the handout rather than downloading my section of the PowerPoint. I highly recommend it. Well, thank you very much for attending our class. I think we're going to move to the questions, and happy Halloween.
Well,
Thank you, Maureen.
Yeah, thank you. We're going to send you an email with a survey, and the survey will help us improve the class in the future. So when you get that email, it might be in a week or two, you'll get an email. Please respond to the survey. We'd appreciate it. So now on to the questions. You can ask your questions in the chat, and I think there's already some questions in the chat. So I'm going to turn it over to Lori to ask the questions.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, Tracy, didn't you have a poll that you were going to put up?
Sure, I can do that. And why don't we go ahead and start questions and folks can answer the poll at the same time?
That'd be perfect.
Okay, the first question I think is for both of you. Do you need to remove the mulch in spring or does it break down over the winter?
No, you keep it. You just leave it. It'll decompose over time. You'll probably be adding new mulch next year. Dawn?
Same thing in the vineyard too. You continually refresh it. You'll see that it'll break down pretty rapidly too, especially if you're using any type of an aged mulch.
Okay. And you both talked about cover crops. Can you use a cover crop where it freezes, like Lake Tahoe?
You know, Dawn, I was going to look that up. I don't know. I think they should contact their master gardeners, but you can cover your cover crop with freeze cloth just like anything else.
Yeah, I would advise the same thing. Maybe even plant it a little bit earlier. I imagine that some will freeze, but your local master gardeners may have some suggestions as to what would work best for your area.
Okay, the next one is for Maureen. Should cedar wood chips not be used as a mulch? My veggies did not do well.
I am not familiar with that. Anybody else on the call? Any other master gardeners? Or Dawn, do you know? I have not heard that cedar's an issue. Because I know people in this area are using chopped up cedar trees that PG&E's taken out.
Yeah, not that I'm aware of. There might be some slight allopathic issues with it, but most of my bark mulch that I use is a combination of oak and pine, maybe a little tiny bit of cedar mixed into there. So, if you're not having success with cedar mulch, maybe try something different.
Okay. The next one, and I think either one of you could answer this. I have heard of green manure. Is that the same thing as a cover crop?
Yes.
Yes.
That's what they're talking about. Is because you're going to end up, it's kind of waste material from the plant, and you're going to add it to the soil. This is green manure, a cover crop.
Yeah, in the vineyards, especially notice it in the commercial vineyards, typically the cover crop's grown throughout the winter, and then it's mowed in the spring, chopped up and tilled into the soil. So therefore it breaks down even further. Not only do you get the benefit of the nitrogen fixing from the cover crop, but then you also get the benefit of as that plant material starts to decompose, it also will add nutrients to your soil.
Okay. Maureen, when should I prune my leggy rhododendrons?
Oh, I remember reading about that. I would recommend looking that up because it's really, you might be able to trim things a little bit, but there's issues with, again, you end up cutting off buds for next year that you didn't even know were there. So I would do some research online. One of the resources I provided on the sheet has information about, more specific information about who you can prune right now and who you better wait on. So that's something you maybe better look up, unless one of the other master gardeners on our call. Dawn, do you know anything about the rhododendrons? I remember reading about that, but I don't remember the specific advice.
It's been a long time since I've grown them. I've always just trimmed them back in the fall a little bit. And, but again, it's been so long, I would definitely look that up. Sorry.
Okay, next, is clover a good cover crop?
Yes.
Yes.
And I think different kinds of clover, so if you want to get really picky about it, different kinds of clover provide, I guess, different amounts of nutrients. So if you buy cover crop seeds and they include clover, you're good to go. But I would check into that. But yes, clover is used as a cover crop and seems to be a good one. Plus it looks pretty.
Yeah, the crimson clover is always gorgeous when it blooms in the spring.
Right. Yeah. Because you don't have to cut all the flowers off. I mean,
No.
I leave a whole lot of mine for the beneficials, for the insects. I chop some of mine into the soil, but I let a lot of mine flower because I like the way it looks and for pollinators.
Okay, next, Maureen, they want to plant vetch for a hillside. When's the best time to spread seed?
Probably now, but I have to make I feel bound to make a qualifying statement on the vetch, even though I personally love it. My son-in-law is one of the weed guys for our county, and they spend a lot of time taking vetch out. It's an invasive plant. Once it finds a good spot to grow, it grows like crazy. So this is another one you might want to talk to your county, like the farm advisor, as to how good an idea vetch is for you. It really depends where you live, because some of these plants are kind of moderate in some areas of California. And then in other areas of California, they go bananas and they just take over everything. So vetch I love it. I kid my son-in-law all the time that I'm planting vetch for him, but that's one that I think, depending on your location, you might talk to your county real quick before you invest in that too much.
Okay. There was a request for a good company, but as Tracy said, we can't give specific company recommendations. So
no, but Google it. It's easy to
yeah.
find. It's easy to find.
By your local nurseries. And I'm not quite clear about this question. And was there another row of suggestions after legumes and grasses? And under legumes, can you use sugar snap peas?
You can grow most beans and peas are the nodule type of plant, and that's what you're after. It's not really what grows above the ground. It's more what their root structure is like. So you would need to verify that that particular pea does have nodules on its roots. Now, all plants work with bacteria to concentrate nitrogen, or else they couldn't grow. But plants with nodules are usually used as cover crops because they're kind of supercharged. So you would just want to double check if that type pea is a nodule plant, has root nodules.
Okay, I think that's all the questions. There was an earlier one about white flies, but I saw Tracy posted a pest note on that. And she's also added a link about vetch here in the chat as well.
Right.
If you have any other questions, now is the time to enter them into the chat. And while we're waiting, I just want to say I appreciate the presentation. I'm a master gardener, but I've learned a lot too. So nice job, both of you.
Thank you.
And I have one thing to add. If you start your fall planning and you suddenly realize that you had a question that you needed to ask, but you forgot to, you are more than welcome to email us at mgamador@ucanr.edu, and somebody will get back to you with an answer.
Okay, we've got one more here. Any suggestions for mold resistant plants?
Oh, I wish. I don't have molds, but they'll go after whatever. That's what we have raised beds for around here.
Okay, my next question. Well, that's not a question. Okay, pruning question. You guys are adding too fast here. I have a persimmon that has been let go for years, did not produce this year. Should I prune one half or the whole tree and wait for restoration?
I can't comment on pruning a persimmon. I'm sorry.
Dennis question, maybe.
Yeah, it sure is. I actually,
Yeah.
I have one, but it's not big enough to prune yet.
Yeah, I'll pick that one up out of the Q&A and send it over to Dennis.
Thank you, Doris.
No problem.
Any ideas how to keep skunks and raccoons out of the garden?
Cage them out. Got to fence them out. Sorry, it's us against them, but those kind of critters, it's better to cage your plants.
Next question, do I plant my flowering bulbs now or wait until spring as it snows here in Pioneer?
You're kind of talking about two kinds of bulbs. In the fall, you plant the bulbs that are going to come up actually around here in the late winter, like the very beginning of spring. So that's a certain class of bulbs. Certain bulbs are meant to be planted in the fall and they'll come up in the early spring. But then there's a separate group of bulbs that you plant in the spring and they'll come up in the summertime. Those are the ones you take out of the ground right now. If it's where you live where it snows. If they're meant to bloom in the summer, they're not the kind that do well in the frozen ground. So you actually dig them up, dry them out, and you keep them in a cool, dark place. And then you put them back in the ground in the spring. But there's a separate class, like the daffodils that grow at Daffodil Hill. There's certain bulbs that are to be planted now. So you need to kind of look that up and see what type plant you're trying to plant right now, what the bulbs are.
Okay, and Tracy is putting in some more information for persimmons too. And Gail, one of our master gardeners, says she pruned hers severely 2 years ago, no persimmons last year, and this year she has a bumper crop.
Okay.
But I think we should check with Dennis too. He is our orchard expert. And I don't know if he covered that in the pruning presentation that is on our website.
He did not cover persimmons.
Okay.
No.
If I could mention too, to go back to the cover crops here briefly, especially with the vineyards and even with others, I was touched on, I know Maureen mentioned it, but I would like to remind people that on the whole, the purpose of a cover crop is to provide that manure. So you want to cut it before it starts to flower. Otherwise, it kind of defeats the purpose. So if you're planting a cover crop, especially like in your vineyard area, right before it starts to flower, that's when you want to cut it back to utilize it and get the main benefit from it.
I want to agree with Dawn on that because I'm kind of having it both ways in my garden.
Right.
The areas that I let flower, that they're not helping anything. They're just making my garden pretty or providing flowers for pollinators. But I agree. If I want to use the cover crop for what it's meant to, then you got to chop it down before it flowers. Thank you, Dawn, for bringing that out.
All right. Have we exhausted the questions, Lori?
It looks like it. Yeah.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much for attending today. I think we're going to close this off. Look forward to our schedules for next year. We'll start up again in January. I think we're doing soils first. So looking forward to seeing you then. Take care, everybody.
Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.
Thank you. Happy gardening.